Bom, então, estamos aqui hoje com mais uma atividade que envolve tanto o grupo do Núcleo de Direito e Justiça da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de São Paulo e o Departamento de Filosofia e o Grupo de Estudos de Filosofia Antiga da Universidade de São Paulo, desta vez com um acréscimo que muito me honra, a mim e ao meu colega, meu amigo Gabriele Cornelli, que é a Cátedra Arcai Unesco da Universidade de Brasília, dedicada aos estudos de filosofia antiga e estudos clássicos em geral. E desta vez nós temos uma convidada, que é a professora Melissa Lane, da Universidade de Princeton, e eu vou brevemente introduzir aqui, fazer uma breve apresentação e passo a palavra a ela. Professor Lane is the class of 1943 professor of politics at Princeton University, where she served as director of the University Center for Human Values from 2016 to 2024. From August 1st, 2023, she has been engaged for a 3-year term to deliver an extended series of free public lectures as the professor of rhetoric at the Gresham College. This is online, you can all watch it, a non-degree granting institution in London. Currently, Professor Lane is the Isaiah Berlin visiting professor at the Oxford University in 2024-2025. And she delivered the Berlin lectures in Michaelmas term 2024, for which term she was elected to a visiting fellowship at Corpus Christi College, Oxford. She previously served as the Carlyle lecturer at the University of Oxford in 2017-2018, delivering the Carlyle lectures in Hillary term 2018. I have to add that we know lots of papers and articles and essays and books by Professor Melissa Lane. I just want to call the attention to The Birth of Politics almost 10 years ago, and now The Echo Republic, and most recently now we have here. The book that we are discussing now is Of Rule and Office, Plato's Ideas of the Political. Professor Lane, thank you so much for doing this. The digital floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Wolf, and everyone for your interest and your enthusiasm for this event. I'm truly honored and grateful to participate with you. Is the sound quality all right? Great. So thank you again very much for being here. I've been asked to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes about my book, and I'll try to speak a little bit more slowly in English, although I know everyone has excellent English, but I can speak too quickly sometimes. So the book begins with what I call the juvenile conundrum, which refers to the Roman poet Juvenal, who of course famously asked, "Who will guard the guardians?" And I argue that, in fact, Plato put the same question less idiomatically in his essay, in his work, The Laws, where he asks, who will straighten the straighteners, where straightener is a way of translating those who are the auditors of the other office holders. And it's well known that Plato was concerned with accountability and the control of political office in his dialogue, The Laws, but it's much less well known that in The Statesman and in The Republic, perhaps most surprisingly, he also, I think, had a very deep concern with the question of the control of power, the prevention of corruption, and how to ensure and even try to enforce constitutional political rule. So that's what my book tries to argue, and it's been described as offering a constitutionalist reading of Plato's political thought. So if we can move the slide forward, please. I'll just say slide rather rudely as we go on, just to not repeat that. Does it work? You know, and if it doesn't work, I can actually do it without it. I mean, I thought it would be helpful, but yeah, there we go. Great. Thank you. Okay, so this is the table of contents of the book. So I just thought that I would show you how the book is organized. So there's an introductory part which sets out the vocabulary and the framework that I'm using, and I'm going to say a little bit about that in a moment. Then part 2 of the book reads what I consider the main 3 dialogues in the reverse order from the way that most scholars assume that Plato composed them, and certainly the reverse order from the way in which they're usually read. And my reason for doing that was that, as I mentioned before, in the laws, there's no question. It's obvious that Plato was concerned with the institution of office and accountability and control, and he uses the vocabulary that clearly indicated political office in the life of his time. But it's not plausible, I think, that suddenly in his late life, he learned that vocabulary and he sort of woke up to be aware that there were such institutions. So by starting with the laws, I try to show that, look, we can see that Plato is very familiar with this vocabulary. He's very familiar with those institutions. And now when we move to look at the statesman in the Republic, we've been sort of sensitized to that. And now we're going to find that same vocabulary deployed in a different way in the Statesman and in the Republic. I've put in yellow, highlight the 2 chapters that I thought I would, after the introductory part of this talk, that I would focus on especially today, because I think the reading of the Republic and the Callipolis, the ideal city of the Republic, is perhaps the most eye-catching and surprising part of the book. So I thought I would go into that in a bit more detail to give you a flavor of what I'm doing. But just to finish the overview, part 3 then looks at what I call the degenerations of rule and office, which come in Republic books 8 and 9. So that's the sequence of degenerating constitutions in the city and in the soul. And then part 4 often offers, as you see, thematizations. And I want to point out this part because sometimes people think that everything I have to say about each of the dialogues is in parts 2 and 3, but actually that's not true. There's discussion of some important passages that's reserved for the thematic chapters in part 4. And as you can see, I try to take very seriously there that I think we should take Plato at his word when he presents his thought as being fundamentally opposed to and distinguished from tyranny. And I argue that we find, even again in the heart of the Republic, what I call a kind of garden variety constitutionalism, in which he articulates the place of law as a way of making possible civic freedom and civic friendship. And I think we see that in both the Republic and the laws. But he's also against anarchy. And so rule is a normative value for Plato that we cannot do without. And of course, the Greek for anarchy is anarchia, which is the negation of the Greek word, which is the heart of the book, which is translates office and or rule. So arche in Greek can be translated as rule, and it gives rise to, it's connected to a verb, which can be translated ruler, but it also equally can be translated office and office holder. And so I'll say a little bit more now about what I mean by those terms. So next slide, please. Thank you. So I've already introduced Juvenal's conundrum with this question, who shall guard the guardians? And I'll come back to this as I read the Republic. But I think that each of Plato's dialogues is trying to look at how rule can be appropriately ordered. So let me say a bit more then about how I define these terms. So as you can see, I treat rule as a kind of genus in the biological sense, where there's a genus and it has more specific species. So rule is the power to command, but it also refers to the political order which that brings about. But that way of putting it may make it sound too Weberian, and in fact, in the sense of being sort of non-normative, purely descriptive. It could be good rule or bad rule. I think the Greeks did recognize the possibility of, well, they certainly recognized the possibility of bad rule, but I argue in the book that they operate within what I call a kind of penumbra, an evaluative penumbra or an evaluative nimbus, which is a sort of halo around the concept of rule, where there is a normative expectation built into it, that the power to command is oriented towards a telos, the telos of the good of the ruled. Now that's, again, it's a defeasible expectation. It's not always honored. There are cases of rule which violate it, but properly speaking, that's what rule should be. And I argue that this goes back to the portrayal of Homeric kings, for example. So office then is a species of rule. So an office is a limited position of political power that has the power to command, but its powers are limited and controlled by law. And actually for the Greeks, office and law together compose a politeia, or Aristotle says even just an order of offices is an order, a constitution, a politeia is an order of offices, and other scholars have said we should see offices and laws together as the basis of a constitutional order. So when I say offices are limited, I mean very familiar ideas. So for example, term limits, limits on who is eligible to hold an office, limits on the powers that it can appropriately be exercised by an office holder. And typically in ancient Greek constitutions, not just democratic ones, but also oligarchic ones, there were limits that were imposed by accountability mechanisms. So those straighteners that I mentioned that we find in Plato's Laws, that's a species of an office that actually we find in pretty much every Greek constitution in the classical period, where there are auditors who at the end of an office holder's term audit that at least their financial powers were used appropriately. And in democratic Athens, there was a second level of auditors who could raise questions about any element of the way in which their powers had been used. And so it's this whole apparatus and its language, which I find, and I'm going to try to persuade you, we see in detail in the Greek of Plato's dialogues, and in particular in the heart of the Republic. So we're going to find this relationship between rule and office, and the question of what are the appropriate limits. Can rule also be controlled, even if it isn't sort of subject to the same kind of specific limits as office? How do we control rule in that case? Those are going to be the questions that I think Plato is concerned with. And so finally, at the bottom of the slide, you can see that I refer to these two dimensions of rule and office. So the taxis, which you see also in the line from Aristotle, taxis in Greek means order. And so it's an arrangement or an order. So the taxis is the institutional structure of a constitution. It's the set of offices, procedures, institutions. But a constitutional taxis is always oriented toward a telos, towards a purpose. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll say a bit more about that, I think. Okay, well, before I do that, this is a bit more on the vocabulary of rule and office. So remember that I mentioned that noun, arche, which gives us anarchia, anarchy, if we don't have office or rule. And there's also the verb. And you can see that the noun, especially in the plural, typically, I think, should be translated offices or office holders, and especially with certain verbs or also participial phrases. So like to enter into the offices, that's a sign that we should be translating it office. So we have to decide these translations by context. And so where there is specific reference to legal and constitutional mechanisms, that suggests a translation of offices specifically, or especially plurality, because we don't usually say there's plural rulers. We say there are plural office holders, because what it is to hold an office is to be limited. So then other people, have other powers that you as office holder don't have. Now, monarchy is obviously a kind of liminal case here where and I think the Greeks saw it as liminal because although it's an office, it's a singular office outside Sparta where they had two kings. So there's a sense in which it's not really an office because it's the one office, but yet it's meant to be limited in certain ways. Now, what I want to emphasize is that even in the Republic, most translations are actually sensitive to this kind of differentiation. So there are passages in the Republic where in many European languages and other languages, translators get it right. They sometimes translate these words rule, and they sometimes translate more specifically offices. But even when they do that, there has been very little discussion of what does it mean that there are offices at the heart of Plato's Republic. We don't think of his Republic as being structured around constitutionally limited offices. And so it's not that I was the first to translate this correctly, but I think I'm among the first to kind of take it seriously as an interpretative question. Okay, let's go on. I think I have a little more about taxus and telos coming next, hopefully. Yes, there we are. Okay, so I'll jump around on this screen for a moment. So let me speak a little bit more abstractly here for a moment. So another one of the animating thoughts of the book is this thought. In fact, the book had its origin in some ways in a sabbatical that I had in 2012, 2013, when I spent the year at Stanford. And I had applied to work on a project. I was going to write a book called The Rule of Knowledge in Plato, I think in Platonic psychology and politics, but it was going to be called The Rule of Knowledge. And I started working on that book. And I was thinking a lot about akrasia and, you know, sort of the typical problems about knowledge and Plato's psychology and so on. And then I started to realize that there's just actually very little that had been said about the concept of rule in Plato. So we think of Platonic thought as the rule of knowledge, but the concept of rule had been very much under theorized, especially when people talk about the Republic, they would say, and, you know, Popper says this explicitly, you know, Plato wants absolutist, untrammeled rule. And many scholars use language like that. The point of the Republic is the philosopher kings are absolute and untrammeled. It's just absolute power. And I came to think, well, actually, if I want to write about the rule of knowledge, that means for Plato the rule of knowledge. Knowledge is engaged in this political role, and we need to understand exactly what that role is. And so I never wrote that book because I started to work on rule and office. And so, you know, 15 years later, or 10 years later, I was able to publish the book that we are discussing. And the other sort of conceptual point I want to make, which is in some ways this is the most difficult point to express, is that in the case of offices, as we see them today in, you know, liberal regimes or really any regime, and for the ancient Greeks, it's clear that offices have to have these ordering limits. Offices have term limits, they have limits on eligibility, they have limits on powers, and so on. All of that is sort of very everyday familiar. But my concept of rule, remember, rule is the genus of which office is a species. And so rule itself has to have some kind of order to it. Rule itself can't just be anarchic and unstructured and sort of not having an orientation. It itself has to be ordered, even though it's not ordered through the same sort of obvious familiar mechanisms as office. And so in some ways that's the deepest thought of the book, and it's the hardest one to actually sort of explain, but I hope that what I'll illustrate from the Republic will give us a sense of that. So again, the taxus is then the form of order. It's the form of institutional, constitutional order. And we have a different taxus in each of these three dialogues, the laws, the statesman, and the Republic. But each taxus is aiming at the good of the rule. That is the sort of normative expectation. Again, I want to say not unique to Plato. So I think the other mistake we sometimes make is that we think, oh, Plato says that politics should be about the good. And that's this new idea that Plato has because he's an idealist and he has the forms. And that's why he says that. And I want to really deflate all of that and say, no, Homer assumed that rules should be for the good of the world. That's not a Platonic innovation, the idea that rules should be at the good of the world. What's more innovative in Plato, of course, he fleshes it out in a particular way, but what's really innovative is the interplay between the telos and the taxus. It's not just the telos alone. And so building on Joseph Raz, I call this a service conception of rule. And I actually take this very seriously. Again, I think we underestimate that there's a paradox. When we have the language public servants, this is language that the Greeks deployed. And they deploy it, again, not just in Plato, but in Aristophanes in comedy, in the tragedies. It's all over Greek texts. But we should realize that that is meant to be a paradox, that actually a ruler, remember, rule is the power to command. So a ruler is, in Greek terms, it's a master. It's the person on top in charge. So the idea that a ruler should be a servant is actually meant to be a paradoxical thought. And I've argued in the chapter on the statesman that, especially in Republic Book 1 and also in the Statesman, we really get that thought worked out sort of in its full paradoxical form. Okay, let's go forward. I thought I might not have enough to talk about for 20 or 30 minutes, but actually I think I have more than enough. Okay, so this is just, for those who are not familiar with this term Kallipolis, this has sort of become a term of art in Platonic scholarship. It's a term that does appear in the Republic, and it means something like in your fine city. So many scholars, and I follow this, just use this term to refer to the political arrangements of the city and speech in the Republic, which I do read as an ideal city. Not all scholars, of course, agree with that. Some think that we're meant to see that it's a dystopia, but I do take it seriously as, so I'm not going to go into all the details there, but I just wanted to give you that term so it doesn't throw people. Okay, let's go forward. Okay, so this is just a little bit more detail about what were Greek offices so that we can see what we're looking for analogies of in the Republic. So we get a very good account of Greek offices in a speech by one of the Greek orators, Aeschines, and you can see that this is in the Athenian democracy in the 4th century. There are minimum requirements on age to be eligible. There's a length of term of an office. There's a specified selection procedure, which was not always lottery, as is sometimes believed, but even in the Athenian democracy in its heyday, they used election for some offices. There's an interesting, especially developed in Athens at this time, there's, even once you've been selected, suppose you've been chosen by the lot or by election, you have to still pass a scrutiny before you're actually allowed to take up the office. And it was a pretty basic test. We can think of it as a sort of basic test of civic competence. So for example, had you carried out the typical rituals required by the city, had you actually paid your taxes was a crucial requirement, which is an important thing to think about. So this is called a dokimasia, and that term we'll see comes up in the Republic, so that's why I mention it. There's a set of powers of the office, and then there are these specified accountability procedures, including especially these euthunai, or the audits, upon the completion of your term of office that I mentioned before. And there's an expression for an audit, which I'll come back to, which is not on the slide, which is didonai ton logon, to give an account. So our financial accounting still uses that language. I don't know if you say it in Portuguese, but certainly in English we say to give an account, to render an account. That's a financial audit, but we'll see that in the Republic it also becomes more generally a kind of a reason-giving sort of audit. Okay, let's go forward. Okay, so now I'm going to come to the kind of final part of the talk where I thought I would focus in on those 2 chapters where I talk about the existence of office holders in the Republic, the kind of dialectic between office holders and more superordinate, supreme rulers, and the question of wages, which I think is a nice way to kind of highlight how this operates, particularly the service conception. So here's just the example of how we see these nouns and verbs functioning. So, of course, as everyone knows, the rulers of the Republic are referred to as guards or guardians. So that's in the first point. The Greek is phulax or phulakes, and they're called rulers. So the tois arkusin, that's using the participle of the verb rulers. Now you can see then these next two sentences. So, for example, in Book 5, when we're already really launched on the Kallipolis, there's one place where many translators, again, will translate, I think, rightly, or at least defensively, that verb in its participial form as rulers. Our rulers will have to use falsehood and deception for the benefit of those who rule. But then look at the last sentence there, right? These are these plural noun offices. So I think that it's more, because it's plural here and it's the noun, it's more plausible to think of that translation as offices. And again, many translations, I think, get that right. And I'm ashamed to say I did not check Portuguese, so I would love to hear from you about that, but I did check French, Italian, Spanish, German, and since I wrote the book, colleagues have told me Russian and Korean as well. Generally, the translators pick this up, so they'll use like a very sort of statist institutional noun to translate the archai, the last sentence, whereas they'll use a more generic kind of ruling word to translate the middle. Okay, so that's just to kind of show you how the Greek is operating. Okay, let's go on. Okay, so here are the sort of places though where it matters. That was just to kind of warm you up so that you see, look, there's offices in the Republic. But here we see this is at the heart of Book 7, which is the kind of height of the Kallipolis, as the rulers are kind of moving up through the age differentiated offices. And again, we see here, there's actually no word for offices in the first quotation, but it's implied. It's actually a standard idiom in Greek. High magistai archai is a standard way of referring to the highest offices. So offices is clearly the sort of missing noun that has to be supplied there. And again, the plural and the kind of idiom clearly means that this is offices. And then this is the sentence, the last sentence is the sentence about the philosopher rulers have to, well, they're not yet the full-blown super guardians. These are the people who are between 35 and 50. And I love that Socrates calls them the young people between 35 and 50. They have to go back down into the cave, and they're the ones who are actually doing rule. And what are they doing? They're ruling, and they're holding such offices, again, plural noun, as befit young people. So I see everybody up to the age of 50 of the guardians is holding these offices. And then if we go forward, in the slide, sorry, thank you. Okay, well, this is more, okay, I'm going to skip this actually. Well, we can see here that, sorry, let's go back to that for a second. We can see here that, again, like this is a kind of ruling, and there are limits of office, rotation, powers, and collegiality. Okay, let's go on. Yeah, so this is now so now we come to the highest rulers. So these are the supreme guardians. So these are the ones who are guarding the other guardians, and they are charged with, so this is the question, are these people just doing undifferentiated supreme power ruling, or is there a kind of structure to their rule which limits it in some important way, even if it's not kind of technically an office? And so I want to say yes. So for example, look at this quotation. We see rotation here, right, among the people who are the supreme guardians. So each of them spends most of their time with philosophy, but they take a turn serving as a ruler for the city's sake here. And what do they actually do? I want to argue that the main thing that they do is actually oversee and test the younger office holders. So the younger office holders are the ones who are actually doing the work. They're the ones down in the cave holding the military offices, doing the political offices. The older ones are guarding the guardians. They're ensuring that the younger ones remain properly oriented to the proper telos of rule. And I think that we can see this as sort of modeled on the Athenian Areopagus Council or the Spartan Gerousia, though of course with much beefed up intellectual and ethical capacities. Okay, so I'm just going to take another 5 minutes, if that's all right, to conclude. So if we go forward again. Okay, so here we see that each of those, as they are going up through the hierarchy, they all have to be tested. And so this I see as a kind of equivalent to the dokimazia, right? They're being tested at each stage to see if they're fit to embark on the next level of office. And we see this repeated use of this Bazanidzane language for testing. And in current work that I'm doing, I'm trying to develop the sort of virtue theoretic dimension of this part of the education. So this is selection and scrutiny, equivalent in a way to the dokimazia of the Athenians. And if we go on again. Okay, so here's the question, is this accountability? So we don't have uthunai in the Republic as we do in the laws. In the laws, we have these actual office holders called uthunoi, who are the auditors who conduct the uthunai. It's very similar to existing institutional structures in Greece. In the Republic, we don't have that. But this is, I think, theoretically, in some ways, again, one of the most interesting things. Remember I said the same phrase, didonai ton logon, is giving an account, giving a financial account. But what is at the heart of giving an account? It is being able to explain. It is giving reasons and being able to explain and defend your reasons. And that's actually what the highest rulers and guardians are educated in. Dialectic in the Republic is called Didonai ton logon. It's exactly that language. And Sarah Brody's book, which came out just at the same time almost as my book, so I didn't refer to it, although I could have, but I didn't quite manage it. But now I think that our books fit together really powerfully in this way. So we're not going to allow people to hold the most important offices if they haven't become rational. And I think this is a very deep insight that actually, fundamentally political accountability, it's not just about institutions. It's about meaningful reason giving within the institutions. And that's what the Republic is actually trying to cultivate. Okay, if I may, I'll just take a couple of more minutes to make one last point. Or set of points if we go forward. Okay, so this is the final set of points, which is about the wages for the guardians. So this is another chapter of the book. And what I think is, again, it's obvious in the text that the guardians are to receive wages. This is not me discovering something new. But again, the political theory of the Republic has hardly ever discussed the significance of wages. And again, when we think about wages, paying a political ruler a wage, when you pay someone a wage, it's because you've hired them in some sense to do a job. They are serving you by doing a job. And indeed, the same language for wages that's used here can be used for hiring mercenary soldiers. And again, the word for guard or guardian can also be used of soldiers. So there's more text about wages that I discuss in the book. This is the first text, and there's two other important bits of text, but for today's purpose, I just thought we'd focus on this, and then I'm going to finish with the service conception again through the wages. So I want to really emphasize this point that the guardians as law, so look at the last line of this slide. All of this is the end of book 3. All of this is to be established as law, that the guardians have barely any private property. They are not allowed to touch gold and silver. And instead of having private income, they receive wages for their guardianship from the other citizens by agreement. So they are, in effect, hired by the other citizens, or, there's not a discussion of them being hired, but the wage relationship is sort of that kind of, I'm not saying they're hired, but I'm saying, nevertheless, it's significant that they're being paid a wage. And that's part of the fact that they're servants. And I think then if we can go on one more, this is my final or penultimate slide. Yeah. So I think of this as it's kind of the asymmetry of the service conception. So what's interesting is that how are the rulers to be addressed, this is the bits I've underlined, by the people in our city, in the Kallipolis, and one of the other interlocutors in the dialogue says, the people should call the rulers their preservers and auxiliaries. So in other words, these are the people who are preserving them, safeguarding them. So they don't call them people we've hired and that we can fire. So the wage doesn't have that implication. But look at how the rulers are supposed to call the people. They're supposed to call them the providers of wages and upkeep. So the rulers are supposed to think of themselves as being paid wages by the people and therefore serving them, being their servant, even though they're not servants who can sort of be fired. They're servants who are capable of being the salvation of the people. So there is an asymmetry, but I still think that there's something very important here in the relationship about the wages. And I think I have one final slide. Yeah. So this is the philosophers who are going to rule as kings. And I just want to emphasize here the idea of caring. So the language that I've labeled A there, the philosophers have to take caring charge of a city. And this is the verb epimelesthai, which means caring, but in the sense of sort of being a caretaker, caring for someone. And in the chapter on the statesman and in other work that I've done on the statesman, I also point out that the way that statecraft is defined in that dialogue is through three participles: ruling, caring, and weaving. So Plato's philosophy of politics turns out to be a philosophy of care, and it's a philosophy of public service. And so it is ultimately the philosophy which is aiming as a political philosophy, far from trying to defend untrammeled absolute rule. It is rather a philosophy which is in fact trying to ensure that the guardians will be properly safeguarded, prevented from corruption, that rule will serve the people rather than exploit them. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Lane. Now, if you allow me, I would ask Professor Gabriele Cornelli, our friend from Brasilia, to ask the first question and offer the first comment, and then we'll go on from here in São Paulo.
Thank you, Eduardo, Daniel, for the invitation. Thank you for the book, Melissa. So nice to see you. I must say that it's a dramatically timely book. Yes, I couldn't not think about what we are going through in our democracies today, and that's why I think the book is really, really good to think about that. I just checked while you were talking the translation of our colleague Analia de Almeida Prado. And she translated autoridades, authorities, the archive. So not really. Yeah.
That's exactly right. I think that has exactly the right resonance. Yeah, great. Thank you for confirming that.
So now you can add the Portuguese translation to your.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much. So I have only two very, very quick observations. The first one is something you haven't mentioned. Of course, you can mention everything in 25 minutes. But in your book, and I'm trying to find yes, here, chapter 11, right at the beginning, you say something like, rule and freedom can be made compossible through willing obedience.
Yeah.
That can be helpful. So this idea that I have to follow the ruler.
Yeah.
Any kind of decision that can be made. I think that you challenge this idea because you emphasize more the accountability, the waging, the contract than the obedience. But at the end of the book, you mentioned this thing of obedience. I would like to hear a bit more from you, maybe on this idea of obedience. And the second week, Melissa, then you can, because I don't want to take your time, has to be with the idea that Plato is, so your book persuaded me once more that Plato is quite pragmatic and precise on thinking about what to do. Not the usual utopian guy we would expect from our modern utopian books, for example. And there is something that you mentioned that is very good, that I think this idea exactly of the accountability of someone that is supposed to be so good, so virtuous, that at the end, okay, he was so well selected, then it's okay, you give him whatever you think it's any power he needs. But at the end, Plato is more, after all this philosopher kings thing, he's still picking all these guys and girls, of course, on very specific things. No money, no gold, don't do that, you can't do that. So it's kind of the usual way of approaching this virtuous thing, the selection. I think that you showed very well that it is not a good idea to just focus on this virtuous thing.
Yeah.
Because it's not probably what Plato wants. Sorry, I took too much, but I'd love to.
No. Thank you so much. Both of those thoughts, I think, are really important and central to the book. So just to comment on the second point before I try to say something more about obedience. Exactly. I think that often we neglect the fact that those rules about not touching gold and silver, not accumulating private property, apply even to the most virtuous of the people in some ways. And because they're the supreme people, all the more they have to. And it's interesting, I have had discussions with people about this. So some people say, well, it's just pragmatic. They're spending their time doing philosophy and ruling, so they can't make money. So therefore, he can't really think that those people are corruptible. But I don't agree with that. I think that actually it is important that they have the most power in a certain sense. And so it's true that the normal accountability mechanisms can't apply to them, but that's why we bring in these other kinds of mechanisms that in a way prevent them from even being able to possibly use their power to exploit. And to speak of the contemporary relevance, I have argued in some op-eds and things that I think this applies to the ethics rules for the United States Supreme Court, that still in a way, they have fewer ethics rules. They didn't used to have any formal ethics code, whereas other courts, lower courts, have formal ethics codes which can be enforced. So the United States Supreme Court has recently adopted an ethics code, but there's no enforcement. And what I say is, well, Plato would say those people need even more restrictions on them. So they should have more strict disclosure requirements and more requirements on, let's say, not even being able to earn any outside income or to accept any gifts. And people say, well, but that infringes on their liberty as individual citizens. But I think Plato would say, it's an honor to serve in that role of supreme authority. And so you need to accept these additional constraints. So I completely agree with you about that. And I'm so glad you highlighted that. The question of willing obedience, yes, and this is certainly a whole other dimension of the book. It's interesting that I didn't choose to present it. So in a way, the book, this is the against anarchy part of the book also, although I think maybe you were, the against anarchy chapter. And in a way, I do find myself sort of on Plato's side in some ways in this, in that I think that modern philosophy, again, has tended to try to downplay the sense in which people who hold political office are rulers who have the power to issue commands and other, that's just a representative power or paradigmatic power. It's not the only power, and that is a hierarchical relationship. And I do think that that's something that, again, we tend to want to blind ourselves to in modern political theory. We think, well, but if it's a democracy, somehow because, it's not really hierarchical or something. And I think Plato is trying to get us to own up to the fact that the relationship of rule is a rule of directive authority. Now, it does make a difference what the nature of that authority is, what the limits on it are. I'm not saying that any such rule is defensible, but the fact of rule, I think, even in a democracy, and I think this is what the decline of the democracy in Book 8 is trying to show, is that if people don't, in fact, recognize and value that hierarchical relationship, then democracy sort of deteriorates from within. And I call it becomes a shadow play. And in fact, in Book 8, Socrates says, the thing with that declining democracy is it's rulers who don't want to act as rulers and kind of people who don't want to obey them. And if that's the case on both sides, then you don't really have a constitutional political order. You just have a pretense of one in that way. Now, then the whole challenge is how do you make that compatible with freedom? And but I think maybe we should take some other questions, and I'm sure that question will come back. And if it doesn't, perhaps I can come back to it. So thank you so much. Of course, that's really delighted to be in conversation with you about this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele, and thank you, Melissa. If you don't mind, before I pass to you, Victor, just on this, because I also had a question that I think it's going in a similar direction. Now that I see what Gabriele asks you, let me try to elaborate this. So it starts actually not on chapter 11, but in the second chapter when you are discussing figures, vocabulary, stances, and on page 77, you talk about the notion of a discursive legislation and the whole Platonic idea of this constitution and this city in speech, etc., etc. Right. Well, my question is this. This seems to be operating in your argument and throughout the book, sort of a pivotal role to combine with the idea of a non-coercive conception of what it is to use persuasion and force, right? So 2 pages afterwards, you mentioned André Lack's books that from, I believe it's quite recent, right? I haven't read it, so I just see that his idea of a legislative utopia in which force is reduced as much as possible, etc. And you finished with this distinction by suggested by Michael Walter, right? When the criticism is from within the actual structure from society, and when the criticism, the social criticism, is from without, from an external point of view, right? So, and you think that there's a mixture of this and this, right? My question is, isn't it a little bit to downplay the actual force of the expression? This is nobody can laugh at me because I always mention these very same passages, but please. So you have it on Gorgias. This is 517 BC, right? And you have this idea that the sole role, right? The monon ergon, the sole function of the good politician, right, is to metabibas dentas epitemias kai me epitrepin peitontes kai diasdomenoi epituten, etc., etc. So you have to alter their appetites, their desires through persuasion or force or coercion.
Right.
How would you translate exactly? But I am following. I know you have an article on persuasion and force, but unfortunately, I do not have access to this in any library here. But okay, so I don't know how you translate this. And the point would be, right, connecting now with chapter 11 that Gabriele mentioned. How exactly is this notion of the willingness obedience? And you quote Gorgias, but you focus mostly on the laws. And so this is my question: is it a downplay of the passage, or do you think that is the occurrence of the same phraseology on Gorgias, Republic 7, and then the Statesman should suggest that we are dealing with something stronger in terms of what the ruler can actually do? Not only the law has these two faces, these two aspects, right? So to persuade as a prelude, as you analyze in the book, and then to coerce. So sorry to be kind of confusing here, but this is the
no. On the contrary, I'm so impressed that you've read the book so thoroughly and carefully. Let me set aside for a moment the discursive legislation. Well, yeah, let me address the substance of the problem, and then I can say something about the discursive legislation, because I think that's a little bit different. But and I'd be happy to send you the persuasion and coercion piece. I see willing obedience for Plato as, I like to call it as a sort of success conception. I mean, in the sense that you have to actually succeed in having that be the case. And if in fact it is not the case that people are willingly obeying, then in fact it's not a good polity. And I think in the Republic that's expressed more in terms of moderation, you know, where the virtue of Sophrosine is that both sides agree, both the ruler and the ruled agree on who should rule. So it's expressed in those terms in part, and in the laws we get more the formulation of the willing obedience. So in that sense, it is very important to Plato, I think, that it is genuinely willing, but I think he's more open-minded in some way than maybe contemporary liberals would want him to be as to how the willingness is produced. And so the point of my argument in that Persuasion and Force paper was that although sometimes Plato will use an opposition between those terms, which sometimes is sort of standard in Greek, you know, where sometimes they'll say persuasion or force, or, you know, in other times, and I think in some of these crucial passages, they're not necessarily opposed. You sort of use whichever one will work, or you try both, or you may need both, or I don't think he draws the line of political legitimacy, as it were, between persuasion and force. I think sometimes force is used in order to produce the willing obedience, but yet it can still count as willing obedience. Now, that's a difficult thought, and we would sort of need to explicate it in each of the different contexts. But, you know, in the Gorgias context, for example, I think that's very telling, where, you know, changing people's desires, their appetites, you know, how exactly do you do that? I mean, today we would think about, you know, is that manipulation? Is it, you know, subliminal? Is it, you know, there's sort of all kinds of ways you might do it that aren't sort of frontal persuasion. And of course, then the sort of repertoire of the normative range of persuasion, of course, as many people have discussed, especially in the context of the preludes and the laws, is also quite broad. And, you know, it's not clear that everything that Plato would count as persuasion we would count as sort of fully voluntary, rational persuasion or something like that. So that's sort of the direction of the answer. I mean, I think we would need to have a longer conversation to talk about each passage. The discursive legislation point, I think, is maybe a little bit different, because that's really talking about the fact that both the Republic and the laws, and again, this is obvious on the surface of the text of the Republic and the laws, but it hadn't been discussed much as a parallel. Both of them take the same structure, where at a certain point, the main interlocutors say, let's construct a city in speech and logoi, and you know that's contrasted with a city in deed and ergoi. And then how they do it in both is by issuing what they call laws. So, you know, and so that's an absolute parallel between the Republic and the laws. The two dialogues have exactly the same structure in that respect. And the point that I wanted to make about discursive legislation is that in doing that, they're doing it in speech. So they are not themselves exercising coercion, but actual lawgivers would have to combine persuasion and coercion. So I think we perhaps agree about that. That was the key distinction. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. Now, Victor, please, could you pick the mic? Tem microphone aqui. We have a new one for you.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I just have a quick question on your argument that wages are meant to limit power somehow. You make a connection with Book 1 of the Republic when Socrates is discussing with Thrasymachus the sternetike, the techne for getting wages. And there is a point in 346e where Socrates asks whether a techne, the exercise of a techne, would benefit even if the person didn't get anything out of it. And he answers, yes, it would benefit. And then he goes on to say, well, but we need to benefit the person exercising the techne nevertheless. And in face of this, I would like to ask whether you are willing maybe to qualify your claim somehow, because it seems to me that wages are not quite limiting the power of the person exercising the office, but they serve as a check against their being corrupted in power. So having wage is something that prevents someone from being corrupted and keeps them exercising power on the basis of a craft. And as long as they are exercising power on the basis of a craft, they will always benefit the persons who are being ruled.
Yes.
The craft is for the sake of the persons who are being ruled.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you about that. I think you put it very well. And I think it's right that certainly in a kind of ordinary sense of limit, I think what you're saying is correct, that they're not operating in fact as an ordinary sense of limiting power, but exactly as a check against their being corrupted. So I agree with that. I think, however, I sometimes use limit in the book in a more abstract kind of way, where it's a sort of conceptual limit to the nature of the role. And so what I mean by that is then, because they're meant to think of themselves as being paid wages, and they're meant to address the people as payers of my wages, that is a way of kind of delimiting their understanding of their role. And in that way, it sort of contributes to a kind of limit on the role, but it's not that bit of it is not a legally enforceable limit, although it derives from the legally enforceable limits on their not possessing property. But I agree with you that in some way, the fundamental point is that in some way it's almost before they can't even possibly become corrupted because they don't have any property. And so then the wages sort of act to, the wages come in because they don't have property. They need to get an income somehow, or to have meals to live off, to be able to live off the meals. But all of that together is sort of part of the package of them not being corrupted or corruptible. So yes, thank you very much.
Pedro?
Thank you very much, Professor Lane. It was a very illuminating and insightful talk. I didn't have the pleasure to read your book yet, so take my question with a grain of salt, please, because I don't know if you mentioned this passage. But in Republic Book 9, I think 580D, I guess, Socrates assigns to each element of the soul, each constituent of the soul, specific types of pleasures, hedonai, desires, hyptomai, and archai, authorities or rules. And I was wondering how your study on the concept of arche in Plato as both rule and office could illuminate this passage, this very famous passage on Platonic moral psychology, tying it back to your initial project on Plato's rule of knowledge and your initial interest on Plato's moral psychology. So what would it mean to assign arche to each soul element, and more specifically to the irrational elements of the soul? How would you understand this passage now after your book on arche in Plato's political philosophy?
Thank you. This is a great question, and I don't think I do talk about that passage, and I clearly should have. So I really appreciate the question. Let me try to answer it a bit more generally, because one objection that I had as I was working on the book and presenting parts of it was that someone said, a colleague at Princeton said to me, how can this be true that there's this important distinction between rule and office on the political level? Because what is the analog in the soul? There's meant to be rule in the soul also, but there's no equivalent distinction. So, how can it be so important in the politics? And I think my answer to that would be, well, twofold, I guess. One is, I think, again, because rule is the more general notion, it's the crucial thing to show is that there's rule in the soul, and that rule involves a kind of structured order. So clearly there's a taxis that's appropriate in the soul, where the parts of the soul have to be in an appropriate relationship. And so, and that sense of a sort of structured, ordered hierarchy is really the heart of what I mean by rule in the politics, and we find that in the soul. Now, one of the differences between the polity and the soul, of course, is that properly understood, rule, all the parts of the soul have the same sort of me, as it were. I mean, it's, if they operate wrongly, then they each have their own interests that they're kind of fighting against the other parts. But when they're properly harmonized, they're all operating for the good of the same individual. And that's different in the politics, where one person is ruling someone else. So we have the kind of potential for conflict and the question of accountability between people that doesn't arise in the soul, I think, in the same way. So I think that's why we need an additional set of structures in the polity, which is offices, but where we don't need those in the soul. Although he does, as you know, in books 8 and 9, he does use all kinds of political language in discussing the degenerating soul and the structure of the soul. So he talks about the acropolis of the soul, and so he can apply the language figuratively, but I think there is a structural difference. Now, having said all of that, I actually don't know what to say about the passage that you asked me about, because I think my general approach to rule in the soul has been to focus on, the reason has to rule the other two parts. So the idea that each has a proper arche, you're right, that's in the text. And I haven't really done enough to kind of grapple with that. So I'm working on the moral psychology now further, as I said. So this will be a good challenge for me to take up. So, and if you have thoughts about it, please do feel free to email me. I would love to hear them.
Thank you, Professor Lane. We have one more question here. Is it okay for you?
Of course.
Okay, so Andrea, please.
Thank you, Professor Lane, for this beautiful conference. I want to read your book when it's possible. Well, my question have a little bit of relation to the question of Pedro, but now I focus in the book 4, in the concept of justice. The book 4, we are told about analogy between the city and the soul, and so in the soul, the justice is the logistikon, epimetikon, timoides. Each one does his own business.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same we are told about, is the same in the city. The justice is the accountants, the craftsman doing his own business. But now here in your conference, we are told about the limits, the limits to the activity of the roles, to the limits of the offices, and also that the telos of the role is the good of the world people. So, do you think that is so? We have a limit for the analogy between the soul and the city, because in book 4 there is no apparently there is no limits for the logistikon role in the soul, and there is not exactly the logistikon acts for the good for the other parts of the soul. So do you think we can speak of a limit for the analogy?
Yeah, thank you so much. These are all great questions, and I really appreciate you pushing me on the moral psychology. I think I can give you a good answer to the first question and maybe not quite as good an answer to the second question. So I would say there are limits to the rule of the logistikon in the soul that are implied, in the sense that I was saying that the very role of being a ruler kind of conceptually involves being properly oriented to, what you're meant to be doing. So if the logistikon, starts sort of randomly, telling you, oh, the good of the soul is that, you should go and gamble away all your money, or, something like that, or, the good of the soul is, to take up smoking and, kind of, or what, some sort of self-destructive activity, then the logisticon is not doing its role properly. So I think, again, this is actually a good example where it might look like the rule is unlimited. There's no limit set to it kind of explicitly. But when you think about what's the point of it, the point of the rule of the logisticon is the good of let's say the good of the soul, of the whole person. And now I'm going to come in a minute to your second question. And so if the logisticon just starts acting in such a way that it's just flouting that good, then it really isn't doing its job. So it's literally not doing its own ergon. So again, it goes back to my idea that rule itself is an evaluative role. It has a normative purpose. Now, we know, of course, in some souls, the logisticon rules badly. In the oligarch, it's, ruling for the wrong telos and so on. So I'm not saying that can't happen, but the limits are implied in that orientation and that kind of evaluative aim. Okay, so then the second question is, okay, well, whose good is it? And this is interesting. Again, maybe I should have probably spelled this out more. Again, I think there is a difference between the politics and the psychology, just to repeat what I said to the previous question, which is that in the politics, there really is an interpersonal difference. And so it's hard to get one person to adopt as their aim the good of the other person. And actually, it's very interesting that in the statesman, that person is not really even fleshed out. It's a sort of, I've called it a cipher. I don't know if that word means something to you in English, but it's just almost like an abstract idea of, there has to be someone, the statesman, whose aim is the good of the world, but we don't even know who is that person. Why would they do it? The statesman sort of doesn't get into that because it just wants to make that abstract point. In the Republic, in the case of the soul, though, I think ideally there isn't a conflict between the good of the epithematicon, the good of each part of the soul and the good of the whole person. The harmonious whole person is harmonious when all the three parts are working together. Now, it is good for the epithematicon, I take it, so the third part of the soul, the appetites and desiring part, it is good for that part to be under the rule of the logisticon. That is meant to be what's, it's good. So it is for its good, but it's true that I think what you're saying is right, and what the previous question Pedro was also saying is right. I shouldn't imply that it's limited. It's not as if it's good for the epithematicon, but not good for the logisticon. It's good for all of it, and the thumos. It's good for the whole thing, including being good for each thing. And that is a little bit different in some ways, I think, from the political case. So this is very good. And again, it pushes me on the moral psychology. Yeah.
Thank you once again, Professor Lane. If you allow me a final question, I know we're approaching our end.
I'm fine for time, so whatever time. I thought we were going on actually almost another hour, so I have plenty of time.
That's good.
Yeah.
So let me press you a little bit on this point, because there's an excellent image you would point in chapter 1 when you presented the project, and you said that. Of course, Plato, this is page 20. Of course, Plato would develop a profoundly original and counterintuitive account of the true nature of the good of the ruled, rooted in the good as such, that is the form of the good. And then this is the phrase that I love. A study of Platonic political thought without an account of this theory of goodness risks being Hamlet without the prince.
Right.
But, and of course, throughout the book, your effort seems to be concentrated. It's focused on not only these different linguistic levels of archo, archein, and these different conceptual roles they play in those dialogues, but also the connection that you stressed here in your presentation, your brief presentation for us, between telos and taxis for your project. However, one could argue that without specifying in any level what is this telos, just to state the notion of a service conception of the good, the service conception of the end, would not suffice to actually distinguish and to actually pinpoint what is, when is the case, then you have actually a good constitution versus a bad one, right? So just for two quick examples, I think that you yourself actually is committed to some kind of explanation, although this is not the main point of the book, right? So when you were trying to reject Vermeule's approach towards the common end constitutionalism in the first chapter, I don't know a lot about Vermeule. I have my law colleagues here who know a little bit more, and I know that we had here in São Paulo Veronica Rodriguez Blanco a couple of weeks ago, and I know that she wrote about this topic also. So, but when you were writing about this on page 28, you have to at least commit yourself, to the idea that either you have an aggregate conception of the common good and this is the actual good, or not. It's not an aggregate. And then you have to, so this is not the way Plato would go. He would not go for this sort of thing, right? This is one example. A more sophisticated example, it's obviously when you were discussing on pages 239, for example, right? But at least starting on 231, the notion of the good itself within the discussion of the dialectical challenge in Book 7 of the Republic, to explain actually how does it work for the philosopher king to rule, what is the kind of rule that these complete rulers are exerting. And when you are pressed to, present some sort of conception of the good, at least it seems to me that you have to agree that Plato is not working with a open formula, with a just formal description of what this would be and what would be the knowledge that these complete guardians and full completed rulers would have. And since it is not open, since it's not just a formal sketch of what this would be, you have to posit that it is materially, it has some content, material content, ethical content, in my view, right? What this would mean in terms of a challenge to your idea that there is always checks and accountability and openness to debate and discussions, etc. Do you think that this is a challenge or not?
Yeah, thank you. This is a big question. It's interesting. On the one hand, I guess what I decided, the book is already so ridiculously long, and so I kind of just, there's so many things that could have been in it or maybe should have been in it, and I kind of at a certain point just thought, okay, I just can't do more.
Asking the author to write
that's not obviously a good enough answer, but I guess what I was sort of wagering on, as I sort of say there with the Hamlet without the prince thing, I guess is twofold. And then now I have the help of Sarah Brody's book, which I wish I had, her book came out just as I was finishing mine. And I sort of felt like I just couldn't take on a whole new thing at that point. But in fact, it would have helped me. So I wish that I had. But so the two things that I was sort of wagering on, and that I still think have some mileage in them, though maybe not enough, as you're saying, were, one was that I think Plato does think that you can get quite a long way with this basic distinction between the good of the ruler versus the good of the ruled. And I think he does start his account of the political good, at least, in just this very intuitive everyday thing, that either the ruler is using their power to, enrich themselves, or to benefit the people. And we know what it looks like when they use their power to enrich themselves. That's all around us. We have lots of examples of that. So I kind of thought that, we can just deploy that very basic everyday idea, and already we can get some political mileage from it. Secondly, I thought that it is important, I think, that in The Statesman in particular, I think he does insist on that purely formal account of the good. So The Statesman, has passages where it says, whatever the good is, kind of, should the ruler do this or that, kind of. And I say that, that The Statesman in particular, I think, deliberately puts the good as a sort of black box, like whatever the good is, the ruler should be oriented to the good. And so I kind of thought that there's a level of political analysis for Plato that is actually in some ways made more clear when we don't try to flesh out the content of the good, because then we can see that, that's kind of what he's doing. And I guess then the third point would be, and maybe this is another way of responding to the last two questions also, and I don't think I quite succeeded in book chapters 10 and 11 in knowing quite how to handle this. But conversely, so The Statesman gives us this purely formal account. Conversely, the Laws gives us a very particularly, especially constitutionalist account in a way, where it is about, the rule of law, friendship, freedom, and it looks much more substantive. And you could say, this is the answer to the last two questions again, that that's good for both the rulers and the ruled. Whereas in The Statesman, he's really working with that schematic. Whoever the ruler is, their aim is to benefit the ruled, whatever benefiting the ruled means. That's the level of The Statesman. Whereas the level of the Laws is, okay, they're all going to be rulers and ruled at different times, or not all, but, they could be. So it might be true that like when we now turn to really flesh it out, maybe it should look more like the Laws. And then I argue that there's friendship and freedom stuff going on in the Republic even as well that we don't usually pick up. So I kind of think we just need to give an answer to this question on different levels. And I guess the final point would be, the Brody book says, what is the form of the good for Plato? She says it's the form of the good in interrogative mode. The form of the good is really just questioning what is good. So she's the great expert on Plato, and she's saying there isn't really a there. So that now not everyone will agree with that, but that's at least one way that one can go. So I sort of agree with you that like to maybe to take it further, one needs to flesh it out. But I feel that was enough mileage in doing it at the levels that I did it that I think we could get quite far, even though I didn't flesh it out further. There.
No, this is a wonderful response. Thank you so much. Just one curiosity, since you mentioned this now during this discussion. This is more like of a curiosity in terms of the history of ideas, because you engaged both with Popper and with Vermeulen, but also with Arendt and Rancière, etc. So my interest in this previous question is precisely because I think that maybe what someone like Popper had in mind when he was considering something like the objection against the non-accountability, is not exactly that within the system that is being described, there's no accountability or there's no sorts of checks and balances, right? It is the idea that the system, it stands and it needs as a foundation, it's founded upon a very substantive and coercive conception of the good for others. And this would be the actual liberal critique, right? So, and this maybe could be read not in terms of the Popperian traditional criticism, but more in terms of the Rawlsian and Waldron sort of typical liberal claim in terms of neutrality for the state and the conception of the state. So this is why I was interested, because you actually did a wonderful work in terms of executing the project the book itself sets itself to do, but in different levels it had to touch upon the notion of the good itself. And then I came back to Popper. This is why I was interested in the question.
No, I think that's a really helpful way of putting it, and I see the force of the challenge. And I mean, so there's one version of that challenge which I do address in the book a little bit, which is when people say, but it's not accountability to the people themselves. And I think what Plato is saying there is, well, that also has Achilles heels and fault lines and failures. That's one kind of accountability, and it sometimes works, but sometimes it doesn't. Those institutions fail. The auditors make the wrong judgment, or the jury, whatever. So here's another way of thinking about it. And again, that will also have its flaws. It's not that anything is perfect. I think that's important. Or sort of fail safe. That's one version of the challenge. But I think your version is more interesting. That the liberal, the paternalism of the idea of the good is the problem. And yeah, I mean, again, I think I absolutely see the force of that. And I think, of course, there are parts of the Republic that I tend to shy away from, like the eugenics and the noble lie, which obviously, are problems, and I kind of often underplay them in my readings. On the other hand, I give a lot of weight to passages like in Republic 9, I think it's 589, 590, where there's the explicit reply to Thrasymachus, where Socrates says, so isn't this what we should say to Thrasymachus? And it's a very everyday example, right? That just as we don't allow our children to just randomly do whatever and sort of let them grow up just doing whatever they feel like, going to bed at whatever time they feel like, eating all the food they want. Like, we don't allow children to do that. So we have to kind of recognize that limits and self-discipline are crucial to being able to really achieve any kind of good. And I think that's meant to be a very intuitive and sort of everyday. It kind of goes back to what I was saying before about, for the logisticon to rule, it can't just let the epithematicon run around, eating all the junk food that it wants. That's not the logisticon ruling, even though it doesn't say that's a limit, but that's kind of implicit in what it is for the logisticon to rule properly. Now, again, in a way that doesn't answer your challenge, because that's an example of children, and we're talking about adults, but the city as a whole, it's a whole self-perpetuating system in which people are to be educated to be able to live this way. And I do think that there's some mileage in saying, if you have a regime in which no one can control their appetites at all, then you're really not going to be able to have it, even a liberal politics, let alone an illiberal one, in some way. So I guess that's the way that I would go. But I recognize that it's a partial answer. It's emphasizing some parts of Plato and of the Republic, perhaps more than others.
No, thank you so much for this. And I think that this is connected also to not only to the children case that you just mentioned, but you could apply those discussions that both Aristotle and Plato have about the idea of living as one pleases, right? Yeah. It touches precisely on this aspect. So in a sense, they're committed to some sort of directness to how should one live, would be answered not only in the ethical level, but also in this political level and constitutional level. So thank you so much for this. I don't know if we have any other questions here in the audience, but I promised you 1 hour and 20 minutes. This is 1 hour and 20 minutes. Thank you so much for this, Professor Lane. It was an honor for us. Thank you for this, Gabriele Corneli, my friend in Brasilia, my colleague. And to everybody here at USP, at the Auditório Rui Barbosa, in our traditional Largo de San Francisco. Thank you so much, Professor, and I hope to see you in January in Colombia to discuss Politics Book 1 with the Prison Group.
Yes, I'm very inspired I've put it in my calendar, and I'm inspired to make the commitment to have the chance to meet in person.
So, yeah. Bye-bye. Thank you for this.
Thank you all for your time and your interest. I really appreciate it. Be well.
Bye, Lisa.
Bye. Ciao. Thank you.